Welcome to 56-Bit Cloud Cafe, your go-to destination for all tech topics in the cloud. I'm Athir Zalal.
And I'm Patrick Camilleri. And together we'll be addressing various cloud topics.
Good morning and welcome back. In today's episode, we will go through the deployment and management of Lambda functions on AWS. Let's explore the various aspects of deploying, configuring triggers, and effectively managing Lambda functions. So let's start. First of all, being a block of code itself that might require update of adding new features, what are the different ways to deploy a Lambda function on AWS?
Right, so when deploying Lambda functions, there are many ways you can do this. It depends which method you choose. The easiest way is probably through the management console. It may not be the most best practice way, but it's also the easiest way to start. So you just log into the management console of AWS, you go to the Lambda console, find the right region, because Lambdas will always run in a specific region, meaning a specific physical jurisdiction. And once you have that, then you go and create a function. To create a function, you give it a name, you give it a role. The role is basically saying what the Lambda can do in terms of permissions, what your code inside the Lambda can do when you are running that code. So if you wanted to talk to S3, you need to give it permission to talk to a specific bucket in S3. Once you have the name and the role, you also define what language you're going to be using, whether it's Python, Java, C# or other languages, and that's it. You press next, and all of a sudden you have this Lambda function. Now the Lambda function the console will show you a place where to place your code. There will be some basic code there, and you can obviously use the console itself to write the code. You can also upload a zip file, so you would be developing the code outside of the console, and then you just upload the zip file. And you can test that code right there and then in the console, or obviously trigger it through other sources, which we will talk about. So that's the first way to do it, using the management console. The same things would need to happen with other methods. So you can use the CLI. The CLI is basically a command line interface where you do AWS Lambda create function. And this will allow you to define those parameters we said before, the programming language to use, the different configurations, and ultimately where the code will be uploaded from, and it will create a Lambda function for you. You can use SDKs, which are AWS little programs developed by AWS, which allow you to do this in a programmatic fashion. So whilst developing your code, you could also be developing the infrastructure itself. You can also use other tools, infrastructure as code tools like Terraform or CloudFormation, to create the Lambda function and ultimately deploy that code. Whatever you're using, whether it's the management console, the CLI, the SDKs, or today there is the CDK as well, or other infrastructure tools like Terraform or CloudFormation, it is exactly the same. You are ultimately running that code in Lambda in an efficient serverless fashion.
Perfect. Now with this code being executable from console, there is definitely a better way of doing it for practicality. How can we configure triggers for Lambda functions?
So Lambda functions, as we discussed in the previous episode, they get triggered, they run only when you have set an event source. A trigger which actually runs your code as many times as you need, as many times as you trigger it. There are hundreds of different types of triggers. I'm going to mention some of the most popular ones. The first one is probably API Gateway. API Gateway is a separate AWS service which allows you to define an API where you do HTTP requests using GET requests or POST requests, and that will trigger a Lambda function based on that request. Then you also have S3, which allows you to store files, and whenever you are storing those files or you are deleting those files or replacing them, each time you can trigger a Lambda function. And the incoming data to the Lambda function will show you which file was created, deleted, or replaced. Then you have CloudWatch events, where you can run Lambda functions based on a schedule. Today, this has been integrated with another service called Event Bridge, and it allows you to run Lambda functions, for example, once a day, or 20 times a day, or once a minute, or once every 5 minutes. So you are running it like a cron schedule on a recurring basis. There are many more. You can run Lambdas through application load balancers. You can trigger Lambdas through Kinesis, for example, or SQS, or SNS. Hundreds of different services in AWS and outside of AWS that can easily trigger Lambda functions.
Amazing. Now, as any other code, there are core metrics to be tracked and logged for auditing and improvement. What are the best practices for monitoring and logging Lambda functions?
To monitor and log what is happening inside the code that you upload on Lambda, there is a default integration with AWS CloudWatch. CloudWatch is a separate service. We have some episodes on CloudWatch as well. And basically, CloudWatch allows you to put in logs as well as metrics from whichever service in AWS you want, including Lambda. So when you are printing out any logs inside your code, that will show in CloudWatch by default. The metrics like the number of times the Lambda runs or how long it takes, all those metrics are also sent to CloudWatch. Another service which many people might not know about is AWS X-Ray. This has some integration with CloudWatch as well, but this service, its job is to show you the big picture. So you might have multiple Lambda functions working together, and this shows you a view of those different Lambda functions, the way that they are interacting with each other. And then you can dig deeper and go into specific logs for each function. So using CloudWatch as well as X-Ray or other services like the ELK stack or Prometheus and Grafana, then you can really know what is happening inside your code. Do not forget that the logs in Lambda cannot be stored inside the server. This is very important because Lambda functions can run for a maximum of 15 minutes, and ultimately any logs saved on the server running the Lambda will be lost. So you need to send those logs to a different service like CloudWatch.
Okay, now let's move on. We mentioned earlier deploying Lambda functions, which is constantly changing the code. This brings us to having a different code with every change. Can you explain how versioning and aliases work in Lambda functions?
Good question. So yes, versions and aliases, they are two important features of Lambda. You do not have to use them. By default, you would not be using them, but it is best practice to definitely use them. Now, what are they? Versions are, as the name implies, you are keeping different versions of your Lambda function. So let's say you have a Lambda with some code X, and this code does something. Then you want to create a new version of this Lambda that does Y. So in that case, you can create a new version, and you can easily run different versions to test the different functionality. You can run them at the same time. You can run them in a way which allows you to not lose the previous version. So this is used a lot in CI/CD when you are deploying software as well as A/B testing. It allows you to properly test and properly deploy the code from one version to an updated one. Aliases, on the other hand, work a lot with versions. So in fact, when you create an alias, you have to define which version an alias will point to. So you can create an alias named production, which is the code which is pointing to a specific version that is considered production. That will be, whenever you're using that prod alias, you will be the request will be sent to the version that you are considering as production. Then you can create another alias for testing, which points to a newer version of the function. And only you might do the testing. And then, if you want to update what everyone uses, you would go to the production alias and change the version to this new version. So this allows you to switch between different versions in an easy manner, and aliases and versions are used a lot as well with API Gateway, as well as when testing your code.
Okay, but with these features and usability, I believe there would be a level of complexity at enterprise level. What are some common challenges in managing Lambda functions at scale?
So as your Lambda usage grows, you might encounter a number of challenges. The most common ones are cost management and increased complexity. So let's talk about cost management. It's important, very important, that you monitor your Lambda function to ensure that it doesn't take longer than it should take whenever it runs. The longer a Lambda function takes to run, the more you will be paying. Also, you might want to choose a proper amount of memory, because this will affect how fast the Lambda does its job. Sometimes it is more cost effective to increase the memory rather than decrease it. So you have to find a good balance between execution time and the memory usage inside that Lambda. You might also have a situation where your Lambda runs close to 24/7. So here now you tell me, why don't we use an EC2 server or a container to do this? You can, and you can mix and match Lambdas with EC2, etc. But you can also reserve concurrency, it's called in Lambda, reserved concurrency. This allows you to say, I want my Lambda to always be running for X amount of hours. So this is getting closer to the EC2 traditional model. But by mixing and matching, you have both options now to run on demand versus running in a reserved concurrency mode. And you can find a good balance there in terms of cost management. Another issue we find with having Lambdas, usually a lot of Lambdas running at scale, is it can get a bit complex because you have a lot of different pieces working together in conjunction. Especially if you're using a microservice approach where you have little applications running in conjunction to provide what one big application would be providing in the traditional sense. There are advantages to microservices, but there can be some slight disadvantages as well in terms of complexity. Our suggestion here is to use CloudFormation or Terraform or some other infrastructure as code tool to manage this complexity. There are many tools out there that allow you to handle the complexity of having multiple Lambda functions working in tandem to give you the output you want. Monitoring is also very important in this case, and again, there are tools that help you reduce that complexity when working with Lambda at scale.
As we reach the end of this episode, we've gained valuable insights into deploying and managing Lambda functions effectively on AWS. Remember to implement best practices to optimize your serverless workflows. Join us next time as we explore more advanced features and integration possibilities. Until then, happy cloud computing! If you have questions, suggestions, or want to share your feedback, connect with us on social media.
Also, don't forget to subscribe to our podcast and to leave us a review to help others find their way to the Cloud Cafe.